Welcome to Learning Operant or Instrumental Conditioning. Let's begin with a definition. We can define operant conditioning, which is also called instrumental conditioning, as a form of learning that pertains to response-outcome relationships. We'll contrast this in a couple of ways with something that we learned earlier in a different video on classical, which we also called Pavlovian conditioning. First, you might recall that unlike the response-outcome relationships that we're describing here for operant conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning, or classical conditioning, instead had been about the relationship between two different stimuli. For example, an unconditioned stimulus and a conditioned stimulus. Here, we're talking about a response-outcome relationship rather than the relationship between two stimuli. There's another distinction we can make as well. Unlike classical or Pavlovian conditioning, operant conditioning emphasizes responses from the somatic nervous system. We can remember, too, that the somatic nervous system, from an earlier video, speaks to what we might call the skeletal responses that we might make. We can move our arms or move our legs or move our head to make some kind of response to the environment. These responses operate on the environment, usually to bring about a change suitable to the organism. So hopefully you can see that we've put in quotes here the word operate, and this connects us back to operant conditioning. An important thinker in the domain of operant conditioning was Edward Thorndike. Edward Thorndike had a law of effect. He's very well known for this. It's one of his major contributions, and it has a very simple definition. The law of effect states the following: behavior is modified by its consequences. Let's make that a mantra. Can you say that with me? Behavior is modified by its consequences. To offer evidence for this point, Thorndike had many different demonstrations. Among his most famous was the so-called puzzle box. And the puzzle box had many variations, but the basic idea is shown here in this picture. The cat would have been placed into a box and could only escape from the box by stepping on a particular lever or maybe pulling a special loop inside of the box. There was no other escape from the box. Outside of the box, there would be a small piece of food that the animal could reach only after escaping from the box. And the question became, how long did it take for the animal to escape from the box? Interestingly, what Thorndike found is shown here in this graph. On the y-axis, we're plotting the time required to escape, as measured in seconds, and we have many different trials here. Although the pattern is somewhat bumpy and irregular, there is an overall trend. That is, after many, many trials, the animal can typically step on the appropriate lever or pull the appropriate loop to escape from the box in less and less time. And this is evidence of learning. The idea is that behavior is modified by its consequences. The animal is learning and modifying its behavior in order to get to the reinforcer just outside of the box. There were other things that Thorndike measured here as well. For example, early on in the number of trials, we might notice that the cat would be scratching on the door or scratching on the bars. The cat might have been pushing on the ceiling or pushing on the walls. The cat may have begun howling. All of those responses were not effective. They were not task relevant. As time went on, those task irrelevant responses tended to go toward extinction, and the task relevant response was shown more frequently and also was shown at lesser and lesser latencies. So Thorndike made this important contribution to operant conditioning. Another important thinker in operant conditioning was B.F. Skinner. And to understand Skinner's contribution, we're going to understand something about a school of philosophy called logical positivism. We can define logical positivism as a philosophical approach that relies entirely on testable claims. And I'm going to emphasize here testable claims and offer for you a synonym, which is a falsifiable claim. We've talked about this before when we were understanding what makes science a science. An important feature of science is the testability or falsifiability of claims. Logical positivists were known for their inferential caution, and what we mean by that is they were very careful when they were drawing conclusions or inferences. You can see the connection between the word inference and inferential. They tended to err on the side of what we might call a type 2 error. They might be guilty of reading too little into the data. Rarely did they read too much into the data. And this means that, for example, they would be inclined to miss rather than to make a false alarm. And these terms are terms that you might recall from an earlier video in this series. Logical positivists, which we'll also call LPs, make a strong distinction between the following. Here's a phrase that I'd like you to think about. The participant responded to the stimulus. Now here's another phrase I'd like you to think about. It means almost the same thing, but there's actually a subtle difference here. This phrase is the stimulus elicited the response. Now in either case, we have some kind of participant responding to a stimulus. But in this case, we're only making the claim that could be directly observed. We can see the participant responding to the stimulus. We could take out a video recorder and we could actually record that the participant did respond to the stimulus. This statement seems similar, but notice that what's going on here when we say that the stimulus elicited the response is we're almost establishing some kind of causal power for the stimulus. And that's something that the logical positivists would not allow us to do. They're very, very cautious in how they use their terms, and they would argue further that it's not just a matter of being picky about words. There are actually two different things going on here. This statement is asserting that the stimulus has some kind of causal power, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but we can't directly observe that. Over here, we directly observe instead that the participant is responding to the stimulus, without making any additional inference about whether something is causal or not. Another interesting feature of logical positivists is that they have an opposition to mentalistic claims or internal states. So logical positivists, or LPs, tend to avoid stating what an organism knows, or thinks, or expects, or believes, or wants, or likes, or dislikes. All of those are inferences about an animal's internal states. And because they're inferences, and because logical positivists exhibit inferential caution, logical positivists will refrain from making those kinds of statements. Okay, so given this type of background that we now have on logical positivism, let's see how we can take this further and understand that logical positivists would rely very strongly on operational definitions. And we've talked about these before. This occurs when we're stating the procedures or operations used to measure a variable. So if we're going to be falsifying claims and testing claims, we'll need to get evidence, which means that we need to make measurements of all different varieties. So we need to state the operations that we're going to be using for measuring whatever variable might be of interest. Let's take a couple of examples of operational definitions that the logical positivists might like. A very common phenomena within psychology is the phenomena of attention. And the logical positivists might define this as the selection of a sensory event. So what we might say then is in a particular study, we can look at a participant and we can demonstrate that the participant is selecting one sensory event, maybe a particular tone, over a different sensory event in the same environment, maybe a particular light. And the fact that we can show that a participant has selected one sensory event over another is going to be evidence for attention. Logical positivists might refer to the cued stimulus rather than to the attended stimulus. We can ask ourselves, why would they do that? And of course, an answer would be that we can show that one particular stimulus in the environment had in fact been cued. Again, we can take out our video recorder and we can show that this stimulus had been cued and that stimulus over there had not been cued. If we instead refer to the attended stimulus, we're referring now to some kind of internal state that we cannot directly observe. And this is the kind of thing that the logical positivists would want to avoid. Let's go to another construct. A lot of psychologists are interested in motivation. How would a logical positivist begin to explore motivation? They would define motivation as the number of hours of food deprivation. So rather than saying that an animal is hungry or that an animal is thirsty, they would say instead that the animal had been food deprived for, say, a certain number of hours or a certain number of minutes. They would say that the animal had been water deprived for a certain number of hours or minutes. What's going on here is logical positivists have an inclination to point to the environment. They're saying that in the environment, we can show that the animal did not have access to food for a certain number of hours, did not have access to water for a certain number of hours. Instead, other folks might be inclined to say, well, the animal is hungry or thirsty, and that might be true, but we can't establish it directly. What we can instead directly establish is the number of hours of food or water deprivation. Okay, to help us further contextualize logical positivism, why don't we take a look at a couple of philosophers who are logical positivists. One that's very well known is Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell very famously offered the analogy or metaphor of the teapot. If he were to assert, without offering evidence, that a teapot orbits the sun somewhere in space between the Earth and Mars, he could not expect anyone to believe him solely because his assertion could not be disconfirmed. His point is this: we need to assign the burden of evidence to those who make a claim, rather than assigning the burden of disconfirmation to others. So others who are not logical positivists might be inclined to say, well, we actually can't disprove the existence of such a teapot. Bertrand Russell thinks that this is not a productive way to go, that the person who's making the claim should have the evidentiary burden. They should be able to provide evidence for their claim, and in principle, the claim should be falsifiable. Let's go on to another logical positivist. This is Christopher Hitchens. He offers us Hitchens' razor. What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. This is based on the Latin proverb that you see here, quod gratis assertor, gratis negatur. What is freely asserted is freely dismissed. What all of these are leading to is the important point that we need to be offering evidence for our claims, and our claims need to be falsifiable. If we don't do that, we are going to be chasing teapots between here and Mars. Okay, and let's return now from the world of philosophy back to the world of psychology, and we'll come back to B.F. Skinner, who of course was a logical positivist, and we'll look at operant behavior specifically. When we talk about operants, we're talking about emitted behavior. And this is important when we think about the concept of a discriminative stimulus, a stimulus associated with reinforcement that exerts control over behavior. And we sometimes symbolize the discriminative stimulus as an S for stimulus, and then we have a superscripted D to indicate that that particular stimulus is a discriminative stimulus. Let's give you some idea about discriminative stimuli. A few examples I think might illuminate this. So let's assume that you are walking into a classroom and you see that most of the seats are taken, but there does happen to be one open seat. That open seat becomes a discriminative stimulus. It will begin guiding your behavior. You will begin emitting behaviors that move you toward that seat. And you will be reinforced, so to speak, by going toward that open seat and receiving an opportunity to sit in the classroom. We also have the same kind of an idea of an open seat when we're enrolling for classes. Sometimes students are enrolling for classes for the next semester, and they're online, and they happen to notice that a particular section of a course has no seats available, and another section has no seats available, but yet a different section has several seats available. Because there are open seats, that becomes the discriminative stimulus, and we begin making responses toward that section of the course as opposed to other sections or other offerings of that course, because seats are available. This happens all the time in grocery stores. If you're checking out of a grocery store and you're making your way toward the checkout aisle, you might be looking for an open aisle, one that might have a light on top of it indicating that there is in fact a cashier there, and you might also look for a particular line or aisle that has no other customers in it. That's going to be a discriminative stimulus. It's going to be guiding your behavior. If you're traveling down the road late at night and your gas tank is getting lower and lower as you're looking at your gas gauge, you might be looking out from the highway. You might notice that there's a gas station that does not have its light on, and it's nighttime, so you might assume that that particular gas station is not open, so you will not make a response to it. If you go down the road a little bit further, you might notice that there's a gas station that does have its lights on. That becomes a discriminative stimulus. You're going to be emitting a behavior, in this case driving toward that gas station, because it's showing you that a reinforcer is in fact available. This is a discriminative stimulus. Okay, now that we've identified a discriminative stimulus, let's build on this idea and get to other kinds of operant conditioning phenomena, including the phenomena of shaping. Let's define shaping as a conditioning procedure that relies on differential reinforcement of successive approximations. A simple example might help. My wife has recently trained her cat to stand up on its rear legs and tap my wife's hand 3 times in order to get a treat. Now, there are several things going on there. The cat has to get onto its hind legs, and it has to tap 3 times to get the treat. So you can imagine that early on, the cat was simply reinforced for getting onto its hind legs, and then at some later point, the cat would be required to get onto its hind legs and tap once, and then after a certain number of reinforcers, the cat would be required to tap twice rather than just once, and then up to 3 times. So we're taking successive approximations of the desired behavior. This is shaping. An interesting critical thinking question is, how is shaping similar to the process of evolution? It's also interesting to think about how shaping is different from the process of evolution. Okay, so shaping is an important phenomenon within operant conditioning. Another important phenomenon is the phenomenon of behavioral contrast, a change in the strength of one response that occurs when the rate of reward of a second response, or of the first response under different conditions, is changed. Now that sounds like a mouthful, so let's see if we can understand some examples. Let's imagine that we have two rats, rat X and rat Y, and rat X initially receives 5 pellets for making a particular kind of response. Maybe it's a bar press. Rat Y will also make the same bar press, but will initially receive 9 pellets. So rat X is earning fewer pellets per response than is rat Y, but they're making the same response, a simple bar press. Now that's the first phase. If each rat subsequently receives 7 pellets per response, rat X's response rate increases while rat Y's response rate decreases. The idea is this, that at point 2 in our experiment, that's after we've had this initial training, the 2 rats are receiving exactly the same reinforcement for exactly the same response, but there's a behavioral contrast. One rat is now earning fewer than he had previously, and the other rat is earning more pellets than he had previously. So overall, we can say that behavioral contrast, just like shaping, these are important phenomena in the domain of operant conditioning. Let's also now try to develop a good idea about what we mean by reinforcer, which is a central concept in operant conditioning. There are primary reinforcers, and these would include such things as food, water, sex, or escape from some kind of aversive stimulus. Conditioned or learned reinforcers build on primary reinforcers. Examples here might include money, or something as simple as a wink of an eye. Most of us understand a wink of an eye to be some form of acknowledgement, some form of confirmation that another person is giving to us. Now, some scientists will argue that reinforcers can be defined only after the fact, to use the Latin expression, only post hoc, that is, after determining whether the behavioral response rate increased or not. Others would argue that maybe we can tell ahead of time, a priori, what a reinforcer will be, but in some cases we can't really know whether a stimulus is going to serve as a reinforcer or not. We can only define this after the fact. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about operant conditioning and the many different varieties that we can have. This is a busy slide, so let's stay together as we walk through this. First, under operant conditioning, we have 2 major categories. There's reinforcement and punishment. What's critical here is what you see right here, that reinforcement always results in the increase of a targeted behavior. We can contrast this with punishment, which will occur when there is a decrease in a targeted behavior. So if we have an increase, we're talking about reinforcement. If we have a decrease in that same targeted behavior, we're talking about punishment. So let's say that we want to increase behavior. We have 2 different ways that we can proceed. We can have a positive reinforcement or we can have a negative reinforcement. Let's take some examples of each. An example of positive reinforcement would occur when we add a so-called appetitive stimulus. Now, that's a new word for many of us. Appetitive is similar in its origin to the word appetite. So something that is good for us, if we add something that is a appetitive stimulus, one that we like, after following a correct behavior, then typically we will see more of that behavior occurring. Giving a treat when a dog sits, or in my earlier example, giving a treat to my cat when the cat gets on its rear legs and taps my hand 3 times. This would be positive reinforcement. We're trying to increase the rate at which the cat is emitting that behavior or the dog is emitting that behavior. We also have such things as negative reinforcement, which would be still reinforcement, so we're going to be increasing a behavior, but within negative reinforcement we have 2 subcategories, which are escape and active avoidance. An example of escape occurs whenever we remove a noxious stimulus following the targeted behavior. So for example, turning off an alarm clock by pressing the snooze button. If we want to snooze just a little bit more, we can hit that alarm button and we'll keep on hitting it. That is to say, the behavior of reaching for the snooze button will tend to increase if we get reinforced with getting just a little bit more sleep. We're removing this noxious stimulus. That's the annoying alarm that would be going off. We're still, though, increasing behavior being the reach to the alarm clock. On the other side of negative reinforcement, we have the phenomenon of active avoidance. Behavior avoids noxious stimulus in this case. So, for example, we might study to avoid getting a bad grade. We might show up on time in class to avoid receiving some kind of late penalty. What we're trying to do here is avoid some kind of aversive stimulus rather than obtaining a appetitive stimulus. We're trying to avoid a noxious stimulus. And the behavior that we're targeting will be increasing because this is still under the rubric of reinforcement. Let's now move to the other side of this diagram and we'll talk about punishment, which, as we said before, is about decreasing an undesired behavior. So we have two forms of punishment, so-called positive punishment and negative punishment. In positive punishment, we add a noxious stimulus following the behavior that we want to go away. So for example, maybe a child had been cursing, and we don't want the child to curse. So we now add a noxious stimulus, which would be, in this case, spanking, and we would presume to see a decrease in the cursing behavior. On the side of negative punishment, we can now remove an appetitive stimulus following the undesired behavior. So now maybe the child has been cursing, and what we do is we send the child to their room, removing them from maybe a preferred room. Maybe they preferred to be in a room where there were many other family members or friends, and now they have to go alone to their room. So we're removing this preferred stimulus, the appetitive stimulus, which would be the room that they would like to be in. We're forcing them to go to another room, which is not intrinsically noxious, but we are instead removing some kind of appetitive stimulus, in this case, maybe the company of others. So, to sum up, we have punishment being contrasted with reinforcement. The critical feature to remember is that reinforcement always increases a targeted behavior, whereas punishment is going to be decreasing a targeted behavior. At the bottom of the slide, we have some other pairs of terms that will help us to more fully remember this busy component that we have up here. First, we have the difference between positive and negative. Positive meaning the presence of a stimulus, negative meaning the absence of a stimulus. As we've said a couple of times, we can contrast this pair. Reinforcement is about increasing behavior, and punishment is about decreasing behavior. And then we have escape versus avoidance. In escape, we're removing a stimulus. In avoidance, we're preventing a stimulus. So, given these pairs, we can more fully understand this layout. Okay, having contrasted reinforcement with punishment under the domain of operant conditioning, let's move on to our final phenomenon of this video, and we'll talk about the idea of schedules of reinforcement. There are different kinds of schedules of reinforcement. One category is the so-called continuous reinforcement category. Here, a reward is earned after each desired response. We're continuously reinforcing responses, and these are vulnerable to extinction. That is to say that if we stop rewarding a particular response, that response will tend to cease to occur. It will go to extinction. We can contrast continuous reinforcement with partial reinforcement. Here, a reward is earned only after multiple desired responses. Interestingly, partially reinforced behaviors are relatively resistant to extinction. An example would be gambling. Okay, let's build on the idea of partial reinforcement, and we'll now see that there are different kinds of partial reinforcement schedules. One family of such partial reinforcement schedules is called the fixed reinforcement schedule. And there are different varieties here too. There's the fixed ratio schedule, which is also called an FR, for fixed ratio, and here reinforcement occurs after a set number of responses. So if we have an FR2 schedule, reinforcement occurs after every 2 responses. Buy 2 soft drinks, get the third one free, is one way to think about this. We can contrast these ratio schedules with interval schedules. Let's think of the FI, or fixed interval schedule, in the following way. Reinforcement of the first response after a set time duration. So here are some examples. There's such a thing as a FI, or fixed interval 300 schedule. Here, reinforcement will occur after the first response is made after 300 seconds have elapsed, or that's 5 minutes. So if an animal responds prior to the 5 minutes, no reinforcement is given. But as soon as the animal responds after the 5 minutes, then and only then is the reinforcement given. Here's another example. Mom rewards requests for attention only on the first request after 5 minutes. Other requests, those coming earlier, for example, will be ignored. Also, those coming after the first response will be ignored. So there's a time interval that's setting a limit on how frequently the reinforcer will be delivered in any kind of interval schedule. To contrast these two with each other, please notice that the ratio schedule is based on the number of responses that a participant makes, independent of how much time has elapsed. By contrast, the interval schedule is contingent on the passage of time, regardless of the number of responses that the person will make before that time has elapsed. So we have the difference between a ratio schedule and an interval schedule. What these two have in common, though, is that they are both fixed. That is, there's a fixed number of responses, or there's a fixed duration of time. We can contrast these with so-called variable reinforcement schedules. And there's some similarities and differences here. Let's see if we can understand these. The VR schedule, or variable ratio schedule, can be defined as follows. Reinforcement occurs after an average number of responses, rather than a fixed number of responses. So in a VR 200 schedule, that's a variable ratio 200 schedule, reinforcement might occur after every 200 responses on average. You can never really be sure how many responses to make. You have to make a certain average number of responses. Here's an example. A telephone salesperson needs to make, on average, 200 calls before making a sale. This person can never really be sure when the next sale will occur, but we can look at the data and say that after a certain number of attempts, on average, 200 calls will have occurred before they actually make the sale. That is the salesperson's reinforcer. Let's contrast the variable ratio schedule with a variable interval schedule, also signified now by VI as opposed to VR. Here we have reinforcement of the first response after an average duration. An example might be that you'll see in the literature something written as VI, so that's variable interval, 1,800. And this always refers to the number of seconds. So in this case, reinforcement of the first response after 1,800 seconds, or 30 minutes, on average. And again, the emphasis here is on average. A particular reinforcer might come a little bit earlier or a little bit later, but if you looked at many of the reinforcers, they would average out to a 30-minute interval. Here's another example of an interval schedule that happens to be variable. Email checking is rewarded on average every 30 minutes for a particular person. More frequent responses yield no additional reinforcement. One more example might help as well. We can think about checking the so-called snail mail. It might be that your mail is delivered only once a day. After you've received your mail for that day, there's no point in checking the mailbox time and time again throughout that day. You will not get another piece of mail until another day has elapsed. Okay, so to sum up, we've had different kinds of partial reinforcement schedules. We had a family of fixed schedules, and we have here a family of variable schedules. What's interesting is that these different kinds of reinforcement schedules very reliably generate different patterns of behavior that we'll look at now. Here, we're plotting the cumulative number of responses across time that might be made to different kinds of reinforcement schedules. Here, for VR, we have the variable ratio schedule. And you'll notice that we're getting a reinforcer at each one of these hash marks. And the cumulative number of responses tends to go up relatively quickly. There's also no cessation in behavior after any given reinforcer. The same thing will be true for a variable interval schedule, which you'll notice coming up here. It has a shallower slope, so the cumulative number of responses is not growing quite as quickly here, but notice that behavior continues right along even after a reinforcer. That's a property that these two variable schedules have. We can contrast that with the FR schedule and the FI schedule. You'll notice that right after a reinforcer, there's a momentary cessation of behavior, and then behavior picks up again, and then there's a cessation, and behavior picks up again. The same thing is true as well for the fixed interval schedule. The idea here would be that the animal might be learning that they cannot get reinforced immediately after some kind of reinforcer. They need to wait some interval of time, or they need to wait for some number of responses to accumulate before they can again receive some kind of reinforcement. So there is, in fact, a cessation in behavior on these fixed schedules that we don't see on these variable schedules. What I find most important is that this kind of behavioral pattern is something that is true across the animal kingdom. You will see this occurring in invertebrates, you'll see it occurring in rodents, you'll see it occurring in humans. Okay, thanks for listening.